Believe that the Lord has things to say to us today in His Word. We have moved to the book of Daniel. If you grab your Bibles, open up to Daniel. Today we're going to be in chapter 2. Last week we covered chapter 1. It was a natural movement from the Old Testament book of Kings, where we had the history of the nation Israel in 1st and 2nd Samuel, book of Samuel, 1st and 2nd Samuel, then in 1st and 2nd Kings. These books were written by the scribes, the lawyers of the day. They were historians. They were detailed people, and they gave us a good history. But we finished chapter 2nd Kings all the way to the reign of the Babylonians, who came in and besieged Jerusalem and took away the group in Judah and Benjamin, down in the southern kingdom. The northern kingdom had already been taken away by the Assyrians, world ruling empires, the Egyptians, Assyrians, Babylonians, then later on to come the Medo-Persians, the Greeks, and the Romans. But these raiding rulers from Babylon, it says in Daniel 1 verse 1, they besieged Jerusalem, and the king Nebuchadnezzar gave orders to bring the people from Jerusalem back to Babylon. They were going to put them in exile, deport them from their nation. And as I told you last week, it was really God who was kicking the Jews out of their land, because they, 2 Chronicles 36, they had not given the land a Sabbath rest in 490 years. So he kicked them out of the land for 70 years so that the earth could have revitalization. And it was just a rules thing. God told them to do it, and they didn't do it. And he said, okay, you're going to have a consequence. And so they were deported, taken to exile. One little side note, a little trivia side note. Up to the point of the deportation, Israel had been involved in idol worship. And they know this because of all the archaeological digs they found in the temple and synagogues, various mosaic tiles telling stories of how they didn't just worship God, they worshiped idols. And that was prior to the exile, the deportation. After the Jews were brought back, there's no signs of idol worship in the synagogues or later on in the temple that was restored, Zerubbabel's temple, or even all the way to Herod's temple. It's like idol worship disappeared. God gave them a big spanking, and it worked. And they quit doing the idol worship as a nation. I'm sure that certain ones always had that. But anyway, that's side note trivia. Nebuchadnezzar is now ruling even over all the exiled Jews. And as he's ruling, he becomes a main player in these early chapters in Daniel. Daniel is in the court of the king. Chapter 1, it says that Daniel made a name for himself, so to speak. Chapter 1, verse 20. It says, in every matter of wisdom and understanding in which the king consulted, he found them, Daniel and his friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, or Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He found them 10 times better than all the magicians and conjurers, the wise people in the court of the king. That's what they called them, magicians and conjurers. Okay, that brings us to chapter 2. We got a lot to cover today. Got your tennies on? Here we go. Chapter 2, in the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, at this point, Daniel's still a young man. He's in his late teens, maybe possibly his early 20s, but he's a young fellow. Anyway, the king gave orders. It says in verse 1, chapter 2, verse 1, he was sleeping, but his sleep left him because he had a dream. And then he gave orders to bring all the magicians and conjurers, the sorcerers, and all the Chaldeans, all the smart people in his cabinet, and all the various politicians and guys. And he said to them, I had a dream. My spirit was anxious to understand this dream. So the Chaldeans spoke up and said, tell us your dream, and we'll declare the interpretation of the dream. Nebuchadnezzar said, the command from me is firm. Tell me my dream, and tell me its interpretation. And if you don't do it, verse 5, you'll be torn limb from limb, and your houses will be made a rubbish heap. Nebuchadnezzar, he was quite a guy. Just a power-tripping, arbitrary ruler, subjugating everyone. And so, they sounded off and said, verse 7 a second time, let the king tell the dream to his servants. And the king answered and said, verse 8, I know for certain you're bargaining for time, inasmuch as you've seen my commandment to you is firm. Make known to me the dream and its interpretation, that I may know, and you can declare to me. So, verse 10, the Chaldeans answered the king, saying, there's not a man on earth who could declare the matter to the king, making excuses and, trying to, stand up for themselves. It's a pretty harsh request. So anyway, the word came to Daniel about this request from the king, this demand from the king, because Daniel was technically one of the magicians, conjurers, sorcerers. He was in that group, even though he was a man of God and he was from Judah. And so when the attendant of the king told Daniel, verse 14, Daniel replied with discretion and discernment. I want to say this about Daniel. He's like a hero of mine. And if I could just tell you my feelings about Daniel. He was first, I made a little list of things so I could remember it. I memorized it. He was a person of great principle. He, like in the first chapter, he didn't want to eat the king's food. So because of that principle, he bargained, he negotiated for eating just vegetables and staying away from the delicacies of the king's court. And he was a person of great principle. You're going to see this all the way through the book of Daniel. He runs by principle. He was also a man of prayer. He prays about everything. And some of his prayers are just fantastic. And we'll be pointing that out as we go along. And he was a person of prophecy. He comes up with far-reaching instructions for the king. You're going to see that in chapter 2. He coined the phrase latter days and end times. You'll see this in Daniel. Latter days and end times. We like to talk about that. Just before the second coming of Christ. Those are the latter days and the end times. And so that's 3 P's: principle, prayer, prophecy. A 4th P, he is a person of pastoral care. He gave great care to all the kings he served, all the people he ran into. He was like a pastor. Very admirable fellow, and like I said, he's a hero of mine. And then the 5th thing that I see in Daniel's character, it doesn't start with a P, I wish it did, but he was a negotiator. He was always negotiating. Maybe you can think of a way to say negotiations that starts with a P. That would help me out. Send it to me. Kelley at cclakestevens.org. And Daniel was negotiating, and he jumps into this fray of the king's demand: tell me my dream, tell me its interpretation, or you're going to be torn limb from limb and your house is reduced to a rubbish heap. And so he sent, verse 15, this is his negotiation. He said to Arioch, the king's commander, why is this so urgent that the king has to have this right away? And so it actually says, verse 16, Daniel went in and requested of the king. And he said, requested, give me time in order that he might declare the interpretation. And we'll find in these next couple of verses, he needed time so he could pray. He wanted to pray, himself and his friends. He got them together and they had prayer. And the king, back in verse 8, he told the rest of the wise guys, you're just bargaining for time. And Daniel went in and did the same thing. I need some time. But he didn't get degraded by Nebuchadnezzar or dismissed by Nebuchadnezzar. He actually gave him time. And what Daniel did with his time is he went and prayed. It was really great. Next time you're in a bind and somebody's pressuring you, I don't know how that happens to you. It happens all the time with sales guys throwing a pitch. Oh, if you walk out the doors, I can't offer this to you anymore. Just tell them, I got to go pray about it. And if that's not good enough, then it's not God's will. So he went to his friends, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, and they prayed that they could receive compassion from the God of heaven and that everybody wouldn't be destroyed. And then, verse 19, it says that Daniel had a vision. And it happened at night. I wanted to pause and just say some of the best things happen at night. When you're laying in bed and you're just thinking through your day, don't just go to sleep. Pray and think, just kind of wind down the day and see if the Lord would speak to you. And then, verse 20 through 23, the Lord, he talked to the Lord. He said, please tell me what's going on. And he acknowledged that God is the one who is full of wisdom. And so he got up the next day, went to Arioch, the commander of the king's court there. And he said, Don't destroy the wise men of Babylon. Take me into the king's presence, and I'll declare the interpretation to the king. Daniel is such a guy of confidence, and it came from prayer, spending time with God, getting the heads up from God. And so they brought Daniel into the king, and he said, Nebuchadnezzar said to Daniel, they call him Belteshazzar, "Are you able to make known to me the dream that I have seen and its interpretation?" And Daniel answered before the king and said, this is really important. He starts right off the bat. He said, regarding this great difficulty that nobody is able to give declaration to the king, there's a God in heaven. God reveals mysteries, verse 28. And God has made known to Nebuchadnezzar things that will take place in the latter days. And then he goes on and he says, this was your dream and visions in your mind. This is really important, I think. God is concerned about people's thinking, their minds, and he puts things in their minds, maybe through a dream, that will cause them to have curiosity. I think people who seek after God, they start with curiosity. And God is the master of making us curious. And then verse 30, Daniel's so humble. He said, I've got this wisdom, but it didn't come from me. It came from God, that you may understand the thoughts of your mind. God cares about you, Nebuchadnezzar, and he's going to help you right now. And so he tells him the dream. You, O king, saw a single great statue, verse 31, with splendor and all that. It had a head of gold, verse 32, had of fine gold, and its belly, its breast and its arms, its breast and its arms were silver, and then its belly was bronze, and then its legs and feet were iron and mixed with clay. And then, verse 34, this is important. You saw a stone that was cut without hands, and it struck the statue with the feet of iron and clay, and it crushed them. And after this, it crushed the silver and the gold, and it became like chaff from the summer threshing. And it was just blown away by the wind, and not a trace of them was found. And the stone that crushed them became like a great mountain that filled the whole earth. And of course, in the interpretation, this stone is going to be God and his kingdom. Verse 44, we can jump to that right now. In the days of those things, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which will never be destroyed, and that kingdom will not be left for another people, but it will crush and put an end to all kingdoms. But it will itself endure forever. So, isn't that great? Daniel points out how God and his kingdom is going to be forever. But prior to that, verse 36, Daniel gives privilege and pleasure to Nebuchadnezzar. He said, you, verse 37, you, O king, are the King of kings, to whom God, the God of heaven, has given the kingdom, the power, the strength, and the glory. And God had said that of Nebuchadnezzar quite prominently through Jeremiah the prophet. Many times I could take and show you that Jeremiah spoke very highly of Nebuchadnezzar. And Nebuchadnezzar knew about Jeremiah's prophecies. And here's Daniel, another man of God from Judah, given cause for Nebuchadnezzar to feel, empowered by God. In fact, in Jeremiah's prophecy, he was called Nebuchadnezzar, my servant. God said that of him. And so he explains, interpretation-wise, that he's the head of gold, the King of Kings, and he's in charge of everything. And then, verse 39, another kingdom will arise, inferior to you, and it'll be prominent, and that was the kingdom of silver, and we find that to be the Medo-Persian Empire. And then a third kingdom of bronze, will rule over the earth, and that's the bronzes will be the Greeks, and they brought judgment. Actually, bronze is always considered judgment in the scripture, and Alexander the Great of the Greeks, he conquered the then known world at his time in short order. I think it was like 3 years or something really crazy. It was one of the swiftest takeovers of world domination by Alexander the Great. He was in his 30s when he started. He died when he was 33. Just an incredible ruler. And then, verse 41, you'll see another ruler that, 40 and 41, that has iron and feet of clay, potter's clay, and a divided kingdom. We'll see later on 10 toes, and we know that to be the Romans, and we'll have a lot of speculation on that as we get to it. But he goes on and tells him, verse 44, in those days, in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up his kingdom. It's God's kingdom, which will never be destroyed, and that's Jesus' kingdom. And that, Jesus came at the time of the Romans. So, inasmuch as you saw, verse 45, a stone that was cut out of a mountain without hands, and it crushed the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold. The great God has made known to the king what will take place in the future. So, it's latter days in the future. It's end times. It'll say in Daniel 12, I think verse 9. But all of these phrases have to do with last days thing. So, upon hearing this, Nebuchadnezzar was blown away because Daniel told him his dream. Nobody knew the dream except for Daniel. None of the wise men, none of the seers, the, magicians, the conjurers, all these guys that were in his inner court for providing counsel. Daniel was the only one that came with this explanation. He gave them he gave Nebuchadnezzar the detail of his dreams. Have you ever had a dream and you wake up and you think, what was I dreaming? And here was Daniel. He went through in order and explained to him his total dream and all the details of his dream. And I'm thinking Nebuchadnezzar his mind was blown because he then remembered his dream because he couldn't remember it, but Daniel laid it out in sequence. And so Nebuchadnezzar, he was crazy with joy. Verse 46, it says, Nebuchadnezzar fell on his face and did homage to Daniel. This is a subjugated servant. This is a a guy that was brought in exile to Babylon. He's just nothing compared to Nebuchadnezzar. But Nebuchadnezzar acknowledges him and gave orders to present him an offering and fragrant incense. And the king answered Daniel and said, verse 47, "Surely your God is a God of gods and a Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries, since you have been able to reveal this mystery." And then he went on and promoted Daniel and gave him many great gifts and made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon, the chief prefect over all the wise men of Babylon. And this actually will serve to be trouble for Daniel later on down the road, because all the other wise men are jealous of Daniel because of what God showed him, which is something for us to learn. Sometimes when God works in your life, other people get jealous, and they want to know things like you know things, and you just have to say, you know what, God showed me. It's not like he was so humble. His statement to the king, he was just a humble guy, and made note. Verse 30, it says, "As for me, this mystery hasn't been revealed to me for any wisdom residing in me." The interpretation for the king, it came from God. Anyway, Daniel, he was promoted, verse 48, and gave him many great gifts and made him ruler over the whole province, chief prefect over the land. And then Daniel, verse 49, he requested the king and asked for Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, to be in the inner court. Daniel brought his friends with him into the governing world of the court of the king. He was, we say king, he was a world-ruling guy. He ruled the world at that time. And God put Daniel and his buddies right in the midst of it. So this is a great lesson for us. Sometimes God raises us up. And should we just get out of there? We don't want to be involved in politics or be some kind of, politically correct person. Remember, God put you there so that he could use you with Daniel's principles, his prayers, his prophecies, his pastoral care, and the way he negotiated. It's really important to have that. Now, Nebuchadnezzar is a total pagan. He remembered he saw this dream of a statue. And chapter 3, he's going to go crazy like an ungodly person and make a 90-foot statue. It says, chapter 3, verse 1, 60 cubits. A cubit was from the elbow to the end of your fist. Most people think it's 18 inches. So that's a 90-foot statue. And it's going to be a statue of himself, head of gold. And he's going to make everybody bow down and worship the statue. He's total pagan. And I just point that out because sometimes God has us connected with people that we would rather not be around. We certainly wouldn't be friends with a person like that, much less want to be on their staff or running all the rest of the staff. But there was Daniel, a servant of God, doing the Lord's work in the court of the king. Okay, so next week we'll dig into chapter 3 This is a great lesson. I love the story of Daniel. Okay, let's pray. Father, thank you for your word that gives us lessons on how to live by principle, like Daniel, who wouldn't eat the king's food, or to live by prayer, like Daniel, who grabbed up his friends and prayed for this dream and interpretation of the dream. Or a person of prophecy, how he showed Nebuchadnezzar these things are for the future, for latter days. And to be a person of pastoral care. He's going to care for Nebuchadnezzar, who will